Meeting China Halfway, How to Defuse the Emerging U.S.-China Rivalry, written by Lyle Goldstein, is really, I think when we talk to it is not mainstream. I would venture to say that it has been viewed as interesting by those in the policy community and the think tank world, but viewed, I think, very much as too accommodating to China's development. But it has an analysis of existing literature, and then it has specific ideas about how to create this virtuous cycle, which is something which, you know, we've always heard about, the downward spiral, and Lyle kind of reverses it and talks about kind of this virtual cycle. So what we'll do today is, you've got his bio, so I won't go over it again, but he's from the Naval War College, and he will start out by saying he does not represent the U.S. government in these views, which he really doesn't have to say, because the U.S. government does not share those views. But it's terrific to have you here. Thank you so much for coming down from Newport, and you'll speak for about 25 minutes. I'll ask him some questions, and then we have a distinguished audience here who can ask some questions too. But welcome.
Thank you for coming. 大家好. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you, Steve, for hosting this event, and those at the National Committee. Through the years, I've certainly really admired the work of the National Committee. I think they play just an incredibly important role in U.S.-China relations, let's say in the trenches, trying to improve the relationship. So I'm grateful for that work and honored to come here to share some ideas. Well, my daughter always said I should start with a joke and get to the point. So, but looking for my joke this evening, I haven't found one. I'm quite disturbed about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations, and I find little to joke about these days. With I guess this painting here could almost pass for a joke in some quarters. If you like the film Top Gun, I don't know if you can see that in the back, but it shows a Chinese Su-27 in a very, very close confrontation with one of our P-8 anti-submarine aircraft. And you may scratch your head and say, well, is this the thing that happened 2 weeks ago and was shown on CNN? And no, it is not. But it is the thing, the incident that occurred about a year ago. It was August 2014, and there was a very close call. And I would just start this discussion by suggesting that even, let's say, despite maybe what we're reading in the headlines, the two militaries are out there interacting on a daily basis. And I'm very disturbed by what I've been seeing over the last several years. And I think that to get to my bottom line, as my daughter has reminded me to do, I think the two countries are locked in a kind of escalation spiral. And we need to reverse that and instead think about cooperation spiral. So I'll lay that out a bit. And by the end of my 25 minutes or so, I'll hopefully pitch a few ideas about what those spirals look like. Just by way of who I am, I'm a person, I work for the U.S. Navy. I spend a lot of time in Naval War College thinking about Chinese submarines. That's really how I spend the bulk of my time. The book was a bit of a hobby project, but there is quite a bit of news on this front. I'm somebody who's very well acquainted with China's naval development and China's military capabilities. This is probably a new type Chinese submarine, and from what we can tell, has a very fearsome payload of what are supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. And probably folks not too well versed in naval affairs, but that is a capability that the U.S. Navy does not have today. That is a supersonic submarine-launched anti-ship cruise missile. So what I'm getting here is that in some certain areas that China is beginning to exceed U.S. capabilities, and that's something we want to keep in the back of our minds as we consider the future of U.S.-China relations.
So a cruise missile that can be launched from a submarine that would sink a ship?
Yes,
okay.
And that is supersonic. That being, well, I'll get to this further, but you can watch a video of a test of this missile, and it's quite disturbing. now, U.S.-China relations are in the news every day, and I think everyone here is well acquainted, but here are what I see as kind of two bookends of the debate. You see Hugh White's book, and also my advisor, it turns out, Aaron Friedberg. And you may have gathered where I stand in this debate. You know, maybe it's, oh, excuse me. Boy. Sorry. I'm using this as my timer. There's no clock here, so I want to make sure not to run over into our Q&A. But we'll take it as a mark of respect for my advisor that I've sort of taken a contrary position to his. And you'll note that my book is closer to Hugh White's position. But I invite, the reason I show this and kind of set myself in the context of this debate is I invite you all to read these books very carefully and make up your own mind. I think we're all going to have to make up our minds about this. Now, what does this cooperation spiral amount to? As you can see, here are some of the features that I think, but essentially I'm looking at step by step, Steve put it very well, trying to develop this kind of virtual cycle. If I had to say, you know, there's so many books written now on U.S.-China relations, what is it that makes this book unique? Well, one thing is that this is a book that that delves very deeply into the Chinese sources. I mean, if I had to add them all up, I'd probably peruse something on the order of you know, close to 10,000 articles. Now, they're not all cited, of course, but to find the articles that I thought were most important to discuss, that is the kind of, we're working with a kind of vast library of Chinese materials, and I do think the book gives quite a unique window into Chinese thinking on the various key issues. And those issues span a very wide gamut from, you know, climate, there's a chapter on climate change, more or less, there's even a chapter on U.S. and Chinese strategic interaction in the Middle East. So, you know, this hits some issues that aren't often out there, as well as the key issues that we always talk about those, for example, the Japan issue, the Korea issue. But I think what makes this book really quite different is that this is a book that strives to put some ideas out there on the table, some very specific recommendations, and that's not something you find in most China books. In fact, I brought a few of them along. You know, here's what you pick up maybe at the train station or whatever. You know, Henry Paulson's book. By all means, read this book, absolutely. But you get this kind of you know, typical kind of recommendation for you know, how to go forward with China. It says, you know, the U.S. should speak with one voice. Okay, you know, when's that going to happen? You know, here's another recommendation: find China a better seat at the table. I mean, this sort of kind of anodyne, kind of vague recommendations. Here's another great book, China Challenged by Tom Christensen, somebody who I greatly admire. But again, the recommendations are pretty, you know, combine U.S. strength with diplomatic moderation. Here's another recommendation: is the U.S. should listen to Chinese concerns. He says right about as the book is ending. I mean, what I'm getting at here, folks, is that it's quite unusual for books about U.S.-China relations to actually make concrete proposals, and that is where this book is very different. I set out 100 policy recommendations, 50 for Beijing, 50 for Washington, and I go about discussing them. And as Steve said, I go right at the conventional wisdom, and I'm inviting a kind of debate. I'd like to have a debate here tonight, and that's really what I'm looking to spark. And what I want to do in the next few minutes, though, is show you just some of the evidence that I looked at and how did I come to these conclusions. Just to give you a visual sense of what we're seeing in terms of China's very dramatic military development. You know, China is often described as a land power. That's certainly true, and they're moving in different directions there. But as I mentioned in that very first slide, we have the beginnings of a kind of Top Gun culture, which is sort of curious and interesting on the one hand, but as you see it play out every day in the skies, you know, proximate to China, we can see how this goes in some dangerous directions. And then China, of course, is going to see. By all means, and that's something I follow really closely. But I just added this slide recently to suggest this is the largest and one of the most advanced shipyards in the world near Shanghai. China's in a position with its industrial might that if it wants to, it can rapidly increase its military forces in their scope. That to me is quite obvious. Now, where is the debate going in the United States? We've all seen this was in the Washington Post following the publication of those photos, of course, and you can see that I think we can say that you might want to say the Hawks are having their day. Here's a colleague of mine, actually, at Naval War College, and this has become quite typical in our discussions on this subject to talk openly about rivalry, even to talk openly about the possibility of war. And of course, that's very disturbing. Now, what I find also disturbing is that our discussions that have taken on more of a hawkish character, that those are mirrored by what I see in the Chinese literature. And here, this is I don't know if anybody here reads Caijing. It's a wonderful Chinese magazine. Mostly it's for sort of the banking types. You don't expect to see hawks coming out in Caijing per se, but there they are. U.S.-China trading relationships are intensifying on a daily basis. I know these are kind of hard to read back there. I'll read the key points here. And this point about TPP, the U.S. obviously rejects the idea of inviting China to participate in the TPP. I think that will create some tension. But what I find particularly disturbing is kind of a fusion of those kind of economic tensions, which are, I think, certainly exist in the United States and also exist in China as well. But here's a General Chaoliang, Air Force General, and here he's actually talking about the economic relationship, but he's saying, that of course China confronts a mighty opponent in the United States, and the U.S. wants to maintain its financial hegemony. So to me, this is a disturbing fusion of kind of economic anxiety with the national security anxiety that we've seen as well. And when we look at, say, some of China's military leaders, here's Admiral Hu, recently retired. I think you could say he was the right-hand man of the leader of China's Navy. And if you can read this, it's quite disturbing. He's saying, the United States as the fundamental anti-Chinese force may seek to precipitate a crisis, hoping that internal difficulties could facilitate foreign aggression, or that foreign aggression could cause internal anxiety. So, that's a pretty, if this is a window into how Chinese military leaders think, it's pretty dark. He said this in 2010. And since then, I think it's actually gotten worse. This was some reporting. I watch a lot of Chinese TV. And here's some reporting about the so-called Scarborough Shoal crisis that was in 2012. And you can see, again, really kind of bellicose type rhetoric, 中国不怕事, 不惧武力, that is, China does not dread resorting to force. Okay, so really kind of disturbing sort of rhetoric has become, it's the new normal in both countries. Okay, so this is, in writing this book, I'm trying to reverse that, what seems to be becoming conventional wisdom. I think I'll skip this in the interest of time, but if you, this is quite current. I think this was in 2014, a Chinese strategist in a very prestigious journal here. This is a Beida professor saying, effectively China has the advantage close into its coast in the near seas. Okay, so it shows a kind of new confidence. Wouldn't have seen that a decade ago. Here's another translation I worked on by another Chinese strategist, Jiang Wenmu, where he said, Putin has shown us exactly what we need to do. Look at how he seized Crimea, and NATO had no recourse at all. So, I mean, here's some evidence that and I've looked at other things too, that show that they are indeed looking to Putin's example. That's become quite commonplace. And again, looking at some of the TV reporting, here's an admiral who's a very frequent TV commentator saying, he's looking at our 7th Fleet commander, who is calling for the Japanese to patrol the South China Sea. And here, of course, as you can imagine, that's a little like waving a red flag in front of a bull, to my estimate. And here's some reporting. As you know, our Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, was just in the Far East, and he, around the time of that was in April, This is the kind of reporting we saw in Chinese television. Is the U.S. going to build 8 new military bases in the Philippines? And that's a pretty dramatic statement. So that this is the tenor of kind of discussion in China. As I mentioned, that I think we talked briefly on my earlier slide about that new missile. There's a lot of kind of new capabilities out there that are worrisome. This is the test I was talking about. You can watch it on YouTube. It's pretty disturbing to watch. And these are the kind of capabilities that are coming online. And here, just quickly again, how do the Chinese assess the military balance? They are watching it really closely, and they know that our submarine force will actually come down to just about 40 boats, 40 attack submarines in 2028. So this is I could show you 10 different Chinese sources that talk about this. So this is the level at which this is being watched. They look at Iran's capabilities. They say Iran, well, they're doing okay, but they do much better if they developed a heavyweight supersonic cruise missile. I put this slide in here to show you China has not taken that step of selling this kind of weaponry to, let's say, folks that we don't necessarily like. But this is where we may be headed, okay? It's worrisome. And here's another example of that. This is marketing arms to Latin America, saying, gosh, there are a lot of people in Latin America who don't necessarily love the United States. And that's a great market to sell weaponry. This really hasn't happened yet, but this may happen in the future. Now, all that, let's put that aside for a second and consider that a lot of what China is doing out there, however, is of a much more cooperative nature. And here I would highlight the blue helmets. China has the most advanced training center for peacekeepers in the world, actually, at this point. So that's a major contribution to international security. I just wrote a piece on their effort to take on the Ebola crisis. They put a considerable amount of people on the ground there, including the Chinese military. So that's encouraging. Here's the head of the Chinese Navy visiting Naval War College, actually. And I'm proud to say that our institution has tried to do some spade work on improving ties between the two militaries. So there are these countercurrents. Here's an interesting piece. I won't give you too many of these difficult slides, but in this case, the Chinese scholar is saying, actually, if you look at China has resolved its disputes in a rather peaceful way, and he's kind of arguing against other Chinese scholars, saying that we shouldn't be so bellicose, and that Taylor Fravel is actually right, that China has settled most of its border disputes in a peaceful way. So there are these voices in China that are also arguing for more reasonable approaches. Here's another, probably well known to this audience, Shi Yinhong, a very famous Chinese scholar, saying, look, this island dispute with Japan, it's not the sum total of Japan-China relations, and he even goes as far as to say that people shouldn't neglect the internal factor in China's, the Chinese domestic political factor in its Japan policy. So there are these voices. Here's one more. In this article, they're saying, how do Chinese and American interests line up? They actually line up pretty well in the Middle East. Okay, this was in this Middle East journal. So these kind of articles, which are I hate to say are becoming quite a bit more rare, but there are voices in China that have been arguing for reasonable approaches. Here's the last piece I'll show you on this of this type, but where one of their very most famous professors, Wang Yizhou at Beida, is saying, China has not done nearly enough to provide these public goods, these 公共产品, to the global security. So, this is all very encouraging. Now, I want to shift gears here, just in the couple minutes I have left here, and show you. I promised concrete proposals, and I'll show you a couple. But since I make 100 in the book, we're not gonna go through all 100. I'll just show you a few highlights. Now, here's a picture. If any of you have been to China, and particularly the interior of China, you can, in some areas you can barely breathe, right, because of the cold. And indeed, global warming, I would argue, is really maybe even the most salient issue in U.S.-China relations. There was some recent progress at the summit between Xi Jinping and President Obama back in November. But I'm arguing we need to go quite a bit further than that. And these spirals, by the way, you'll see 10 of them in the book, but they generally go from sort of easier things to much harder things. And maybe they involve one or two big leaps. Here's one where I suggest that the U.S. might embrace a kind of per capita principle for emissions control, and China then might be able to accept a kind of verification procedures, which it has not. There are some seats over here. So that's an example of the kind of compromise that I'm advocating. Now, what about this hot button issue that everybody's been talking about since these pictures came out, right? China is playing in that sandbox a lot, right? What do I say there? And I would love to walk through every step of this spiral, but let me just take one, what I view as one of the most crucial steps, and that is we need some clarification of that U-shaped line. I mean, that obviously is hugely nettlesome and it's gotten everybody riled up for it, more or less, as long as people have been looking at it on the map. So if China can move towards some clarification there, and we can talk about specifics a bit, can the U.S. alter its position, which so far the United States has advocated really that this had to be settled in a multilateral format, and I think that's it's quite naive. Moreover, China has a good record of settling disputes in a bilateral way. So could the U.S. alter its position? We should talk more about these other pieces, maybe in the Q&A, because the South China Sea is on everybody's mind. But what about Japan? Because we cannot have a stable and peaceful East Asia in which China and Japan are at each other's throats constantly. Unlike most American scholars who look at this, I feel strongly that the history piece has got to be there. We cannot just put history behind us and say, well, forget about that stuff, let's be forward-looking. I think that approach has, in a way, it has gotten us where we are today. That is, stuck in a lot of hostility. I think we need to take the history issue, sort of take the bull by the horns. I would encourage everybody in this room, if they haven't already, take a look at Ron Emitter's 2014 book, which, now I don't think it's the last word on the issue, but it's probably the best account in English, something to be cognizant of. Take a look at this movie, for example. There are many movies about the Nanjing Massacre. Take a look at this one. It is eye-opening, I think, for anybody who's thinking about this issue, and it's well past time to integrate this into how we think about.
Is that a Hollywood production, that one?
It's a German film.
German film.
Yeah, if anybody doesn't know who John Rabe is, well, let's talk about it in the Q&A, because he's a fascinating figure, and one who, again, if you're thinking about China-Japan relations, you ought to know who this person is. Well, how to fix, this most difficult relationship? And again, I'd like to go through all the steps. They're all in here. This graphic appears. There are 10 of these spirals, and I purposely translated them in the book and so forth, and made them very clear so people could look at them and quickly ascertain what I'm proposing. But that my grand bargain here involves the Japanese Prime Minister going to Nanjing. I think that has to happen. There's simply no way to move beyond the issue. And by the way, that's just the beginning of the whole process of historical reconciliation. We can talk about this more in the Q&A. I'm a Jewish guy who lived in Germany, so I feel like I have some understanding about what historical reconciliation is about. Let's talk about it. But Japan, of course, has to see something positive out of this improving relationship. And one of the things I advocate is that we want to see Japan on the UN Security Council. That's also well past time, and I think China would certainly consider that if we could move all these prior steps in front of that.
What's step one?
What's step one is hidden.
You seem to start at step
Well, the
three.
reason I cut them off was because it would show up way too small. I couldn't even read it from where I'm standing. But so in the Q&A, perhaps we'll go back and we can walk through the steps on this important one. The steps, usually the earliest steps are fairly easy to accomplish. In fact, in this case, for example, I'm advocating that China and Japan engage in counter-piracy, that they engage that mission jointly. Right now, they both have ships out there, and I've understood they do have some kind of modest cooperation going on, but they should undertake that mission together. Why not? And the U.S. could help facilitate that. I think that's within the realm of possibility. I'm not just winding down here, but I think we also have to consider the larger relationship. And this is a very typical kind of headline in China. The U.S. and Japan are working together to collude against us. As I said, the military rivalry is getting more and more intense. This bomber, we haven't really seen this bomber yet, but those missiles are out there today and of great concern to me and my colleagues, I'll tell you that. But if we look at the larger strategic relationship, what kind of compromises might we see? And what I'm looking to is how can we get to a position where China radically increases its military transparency, for example, by clarifying its budgeting process, which is completely opaque right now, and really out of step with global norms on transparency. So I think China could get there, but again, as part of a step-by-step process, and one in which the United States removed some of the legal barriers we now have in place to military cooperation. I can tell you that I've been affected by these limits on military cooperation, so we want to change that and begin serious cooperation with China, which we really have not undertaken today. Okay, just one last point as I close up here on the rebalance. I think the rebalance has to be rebalanced. I think there are a lot of problems with the rebalance as it now stands. I'm not going to go through all of this. We can do so in the Q&A if you like, but just to highlight a few points. I think that as it now exists, the rebalance is really intensifying Chinese anxieties. I mean, I can see that across the board in these publications that I look at in Chinese. They're, very kind of disturbing headlines, and there's certainly a lot of concern in China about where this is going. I think we have to keep our eye on the global balance of power. And I don't think that rocks and reefs in the South China Sea or East China Sea are really, let's say, I don't think they can impact the global balance of power. I think we have to keep that in mind. If we keep that in mind, we can look at these situations calmly and rationally and bring them to a logical kind of settlement. I think we have to think about opportunity costs, that is, what is being lost in global security and in U.S.-China relations generally because of the focus on the rebalance. And I'm concerned that there isn't really a mechanism for containing U.S.-China rivalry. And what we have, we may have seen over the last couple of days, the strategic and economic dialogue, but I think we need something much more robust than that. I mean, the Sunnylands summit that took place, I think, was a start on working on that, but it really hasn't done nearly enough to put the relationship on a stable foundation. Last slide, I promise. And this is maybe an odd way to end, but I will say that I'm somebody who likes to walk around with a lot of books and recommend other books, and I want you to read this book before you read my book.
Can we watch the movie?
No. You have to. It's a very fine movie too, but I do think we have to step back and say we can't just say, well, from a sort of us. We policy wonks look at a very practical level, it's better to move forward on a lot of these issues, absolutely. But you need to have a larger picture of this relationship. And I often tell visiting admirals to where I work and so forth, I say, have you considered how you might approach the world if Chinese naval ships had patrolled the Mississippi, for some 100 years after 1850? Well, that happened. The U.S. Navy did patrol the Yangtze River after 1850 for almost 100 years. And most people aren't aware of that. But we have to come to this relationship with a bit of historical understanding of where China is going, where it sees itself. It obviously comes with an enormous chip on its shoulder, and we have to consider that, keep that in our minds as we look to kind of structure this relationship in a much more positive way. I think right now it's adrift, and we had better try for a course correction. All right, let me stop there. Thank you very much. No problem, John.
That is terrific. I mean, it gives you a flavor for what is a very detailed, very specific recommendations, which I think, as Lyle points out, is unusual. You know what we can do? We can just lift those. Nick, you want to just put the shades up? Your discussion of the pivot, the rebalance, and you say we should rebalance the rebalance and talk about understanding history. Do you think the rebalance has actually caused some of the problems? Is it fair to say that this decision, which was done without consultation with a broad range of people in the United States actually has been caused the Chinese to react in ways which has created this negative cycle?
It's a good question, and I think we certainly should ponder that question. You know, I could relate several anecdotes along those lines because I was consulted at various levels. In fact, I mean, I might just you know, for example, I recall being on the end of let's say a phone consultation with some important folks in Washington, and one of the questions I was asked was, you know, Professor Goldstein, how can we package the pivot so that it will be, you know, it won't be offensive to China? And you know, that was one of those moments because this was not so long ago that I almost fell out of my chair, you know, laughing because, you know, it struck me as a ridiculous question to ask at this point. I mean, in other words, the damage has been done, and you know. Now look, a lot of people will turn around and say, well, just imagine how much worse the region would be if we hadn't done the pivot. In other words, they'll say effectively have kept China in a box, and China is aware of our military capabilities and so forth. And you know, that's certainly not a ridiculous proposition. But what I fear is if you look at an escalation spiral, okay, it's very difficult to say when the spiral started and who started. And I honestly, I believe it's kind of an intellectual fool's errand. And that, look, when you go to Beijing, you'll hear a litany of, you know, all the things that the United States has been doing for the last 20 years that have bothered the Chinese. And some of it is far-fetched and some of it is quite concrete, you know. And the same can be done in Washington. And I think a very similar kind of list appears, and both sides are completely convinced that the other one began this spiral. But as I said, I see it mostly as a fool's errand. If you've studied any international relations theory, you know that you know, these spirals are very common in kind of rivalry, and that these relationships are, you know, have you know, misperception is impacting them, you know, at every level and at every move, as it were. So, you know, I'm kind of reluctant to say we can't know, but
if
I have no.
If you're thinking about how to kind of change the policy, you need a view as to what the policy has done. I think it's a fool's errand. I'm not sure.
Well, I think
if you can understand what each action did and the reaction to it, you then can make a conclusion as to how to change the policy. If you don't, you kind of are guessing.
Yeah, well, I think I'll agree with you insofar as I think it's certainly worth, let's say, if we've tried kind of more hardline approaches, it's certainly worth trying more, let's say, softer approaches. I think that's clearly in order. I mean, to me, one can step back and say at a very simple level, you know, are we better off today than we were 5 years ago? And I think I could say certainly not. I mean, both situations in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and for that matter in several other domains, I think have witnessed increased tension. So I think, you know, absolutely the question is in order, and we should be asking such
But
questions.
you talk about the Diaoyuan, and when the problems really intensified in the Diaoyuan, and I think that really illustrates what is going on in a broader context. That, you know, we had a Japanese government when we had the fishing trawler ram the Coast Guard, and we had a Japanese government that wasn't very sophisticated deal with it in a way that was quite surprising, and the Chinese responded to that kind of action by a very unsophisticated Japanese government, and we interpreted it as the beginning of China's more assertive policy. Then the Japanese changed the rules on the Diaoyuan when they nationalized it, and they responded to that, and we said the Japanese are being more aggressive. Well, I look at those two instances, and I say, this is like a National Football League game. Any NFL fans here? Who gets the penalty when there's a personal foul? The guy who retaliates, not the guy who commits the original foul. And that's what's going on. We're throwing the penalty flag on Chinese for aggression, whereas it was the Japanese who changed the rules.
I mean, I think certainly there is a lot of sense in what you said, and I think you know, I think these are very kind of gray areas, and what some people perceive as an escalation, I think maybe kind of mostly hype, or let's face it, in a lot of these circumstances, it's about domestic politics, even in the United States, but particularly in both the Japanese and Chinese context. I mean, for an example, I think, you know, a lot has been said about China's assertive foreign policy, but for the most part, a lot of Chinese behavior in these crises has been, more or less, parading some Coast Guard boats around. You can't really occupy an island with a Coast Guard boat. It just sort of goes around, patrols. For the most part, these boats are also unarmed. So, I mean, you know, I think we have to keep a little bit of common sense here. And part of the bedrock common sense that I want to apply to these maritime disputes, you know, I work at Naval War College, so we do have the foremost experts in legal aspects and strategic aspects of maritime disputes, but I am trying to inject the common sense, the wisdom that, you know, these rocks, they're rocks. You know, more often than not, they're rocks we're talking about, not islands. And that these rocks are not worth, they're certainly not worth World War III, but they're not worth any kind of military conflict for any of the countries involved. But they're also, and this is worth considering, they are also not worth strategic rivalry, because strategic rivalry has a lot of costs, right? I mean, those are ships and submarines and coast guards that these countries are building, and not, you know, roads and trains and schools and labs and, you know, you know, energy efficient technologies. And, you know, in other words, there are real costs to pursuing a militarized rivalry, and I think these costs are coming to fruition. So it's not just the danger of war, which is increased, but so we need to, as it were, stand up for rationality here.
Yeah, it's obviously it's about the budgeting for your colleagues are 15, 20 years from now. So they're trying to anticipate what is going to be going on, spending money today, which is not going to improve America's infrastructure or other things. And the same is being said on the Chinese side. That it's not that we're going to go to war, it's the cost of budgetary allocations.
Yes. And indeed, you know, many Chinese, I think, do appreciate the fact that, yes, they want to see a stronger China, and really, in some ways, that is driving this in this kind of, let's say, anxieties across the board. I mean, I do agree that China's military has been making rapid strides, as I showed, and that's a fact. But again, intentions are different than capabilities, and I think we have to keep that in mind. But there are many Chinese voices that are also concerned. They don't want to see all their wealth being thrown at, you know, into weaponry and so forth. They realize that that is a bankrupt road. In fact, they've studied very closely the Soviet experience, and so they know well that they do not want to walk down that road. So hopefully they'll be wiser. It will take wisdom, though, on both sides of the Pacific to get there.
What do your colleagues think of this book?
That is a great question. We, you know, we're having a good dialogue. I'm happy to say that the U.S. government has, you know, has set up these colleges to look at strategy and international relations, and they're quite used to having, well, let's say, a panoply of views. I'm happy to say. So, I mean, you know, there has been, I will confess, there's been a bit of head scratching. But I think, you know, by and large, people are comfortable with the fact that really, as a nation, we need to have a debate about these issues. And the public has to be involved. That's part of why I'm here today. But the military itself also needs to debate these issues internally, and especially among people who know the difference between the various types of submarines and missiles and so forth. Because the big question out there is, is this a threat to U.S. national security? As I'm looking at most of what I've seen, I can say generally this is not a threat.
Could a similarly placed Chinese write a similar book?
That's a very interesting question, and we'll see
Could
where.
somebody at NDU write a book like this?
Well, I will say I
It
was.
would be Nebu or Gorjapalmi.
Well, I was at the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing last fall, and I will say that my sense is that there are many, although there are a lot of hawks. Absolutely, I remember walking out of one particular session during the conference, and this I won't name any names, but a very hawkish general who's famous in China strolled out of the room. He's a big strapping guy. In the U.S. he would have been a football player for sure. He walked out, and he was immediately mobbed by dozens and dozens of reporters. Everybody else was ignored, but he, so you could see in that little vignette that the Chinese themselves are kind of hungry for this. For this kind of nationalist rhetoric, this kind of hardline approach. But I will say, I think he is in a minority, really. Among Chinese military scholars that I know, at least that's the group I know best, I'll say this, there are plenty of doves, plenty. So your suggestion is not so crazy, and I'm frequently quite reassured that they understand the risks that we're talking about. So, we'll temper the pessimism with some optimism in that regard.
In my discussions with the PLA, what they say is you always ask for freedom of speech. Now our retired military officers have freedom of speech, and they go on Phoenix TV and they speak very nationalistically. So be careful what you wish for. Can you say, have you briefed PACOM on this? Or you may not be able to answer that, in which case, that's fine.
No, I mean, I am briefing the book around the U.S. government, and I'll say, although a lot of people disagree with me, there are, people are listening and they're interested, and people have been encouraging. Have not been out to PACOM to share my ideas here recently, but I would like to. So that I think will happen.
I think that would be valuable. Can you go back to your slide on the Japan-China
Yes.
relationship and show us? Oh, it's not going to show us what number 1 and 2 are.
Well, actually, I do have it in my deck here.
Because I'm curious. In other words, how do you're in this cycle, how do you break out of the cycle?
Yeah, I realize you can't read these, so I'll...
Reduce, Marie, go ahead.
So I could just walk through the steps really quick, if you like. I don't want to take too much time here, but just very quickly. Yes, here I start with kind of you would think it's a big step. I say that the United States should reduce the Marine presence in Okinawa. As a matter of fact, we're already planning to reduce that presence. So I think it's great to propose something that's basically already underway. And many of those Marines will move to Guam. That's okay, but I actually think Okinawa will be better off, Japanese politics will be better off, and indeed even our strategic position, I can elaborate there, will be better off if we reduce some of the troops in Okinawa. I argue at that point Beijing should accept a trilateral negotiations process. So far they've kind of stonewalled on that, but I think trilateral configuration of negotiation can be very promising. I say that as a political scientist. I think multilaterals are way too big. Bilaterals have limits.
The third party.
Yeah, a trilateral negotiation. A lot of people are saying this. I'm not the only. Swain, for example, has advocated this a lot. But I think there's promise there.
One of the few others who thinks the pivot is a bad policy.
Yeah. Yes. As I said, I think that China and Japan could join hands and counter piracy. I think that's pretty easy to accomplish. Now. Talk about the rare earths, where China allegedly, by the way, some analyses have questioned this, but whether China had withheld rare earths from Japan, I argue that it's less a question of fact, but China should just say, in order to move beyond this, they need to make some kind of step here on rare earths to say that they will try to kind of assure these shipments. Now, I get that may be very difficult to enforce in a crisis and so forth, but a lot of these steps are about symbolism. And speaking of symbolism, the next step is very hard for Japan, obviously, but I advocate for the Prime Minister to go to Nanjing. I think that's essential. If anybody knows any history of German politics during the Cold War, that Willy Brandt moment where the German chancellor went to Auschwitz and fell on his knees. That is what is needed. Now, it's got to go beyond that, and I explain in the book. I'm even on record. Here I agree with the South Koreans who have argued very strongly for some form of reparations. I think that has to occur. We can talk more about that. Now, what could China do to reciprocate? How about accepting the median line as a settlement in the East China Sea? I think China could go there. I think there are reasons to show that China, in a way, they have accepted that already, but to formally accept that. And from there, we move to what I advocate as joint administration of those contested rocks. And again, maybe in theory, it sounds hard, but actually, practically, that would not be difficult to accomplish. I think we could get there. Now, China has to throw Japan another bone. I argue a good bone would be constitutional reform. We can talk more about that, but there's a lot of discussion about the Japanese constitution. I think if we undertook all these steps, I think China could go there, and I think Japan would be better off for it. That would help their internal politics and so forth. Then and here, people may roll their eyes a bit, but I'm going to say we need to think about reforming the U.S.-Japan alliance. And here, I'm almost suggesting we would just move more toward sort of air and sea forces and less ground forces, But again, a lot of this is about symbol. So some restructuring, I think, would help there. And then we get to the final step where Japan gets a seat on the United Nations Security Council, which, I think would be a very important step for global security, as far as Japan being a contributor and having an important voice. But now you can't jump to the last step. You've got to go step by step and build trust in the spirals.
I think that's very interesting. I have dozens of other questions, as you can see, but let me open the floor to some questions. Start with Herb, and then I'll go to Isaac. Rick?
Thank you for your presentation. When meeting with American admirals, and we've had the CNO, New York for lunch, and various other things, and they have talked about their worries. They have looked uncomfortable when we quoted the 7th Fleet Admiral saying he lost sleep at night over the Chinese aircraft carrier. They said, well, we send him some aspirins. They don't lose sleep over the aircraft carrier. But the thing is, they said, well, the 9-dash line, and the Chinese are claiming all this. We said, well, the South China Sea is China's Caribbean, It's the Monroe Doctrine. They're not claiming sovereignty over the South China Sea. They're just saying that they don't want other people to go in there and grab things. And so they're going to maintain supervision over it. We used to invade various Caribbean islands all the time. When was the last one we invaded? Grenada, And so what the Chinese are doing down there, I think should be very comprehensible to you. I've said to the admirals, and they've said, a Chinese Monroe Doctrine? Have you heard them say that? I've said, well, as a matter of fact, they've smiled when I've mentioned it, but they don't want to be accused of imitating the U.S. So my question to you is, do you discuss the Chinese Monroe Doctrine in the Chinese Caribbean and the South China Sea with the admirals, or will they let air out of your tires in the parking lot?
Probably the latter situation. Fortunately, I take the bus to work, actually. Keep my carbon emissions low so they can't take air out.
You bike in Newport, it's very fun.
It's a fascinating
kayaks
question.
to work sometimes.
Yeah, occasionally. That's also low carbon emission. It's fascinating that you raise the issue of Monroe Doctrine, because I'm considering actually writing an article that would be something to the effect of really looking at how the Chinese talk about the Monroe Doctrine, because it's very interesting. They actually are starting to discuss it a lot, and what was its meaning, and why did the U.S. undertake this approach, and how, in effect, how did the United States get away with it, as part of the, but there's actually intellectually, there's a very interesting side of that, and at least one of the analyses that actually I discuss in the book, actually, if you look at the, I think it's chapter 6 that I talk about Latin America, and actually discuss one of those articles about the Monroe Doctrine in detail, and they actually, one of the analysts says, in fact, the United States, yes, they did, what the U.S. in the Chinese perspective did a lot of, aggressive kind of maneuvers and actions, and that I think is incontrovertible, but
but in effect we're able through, let's say, the provision of public goods and by bringing a lot of these countries along, we're able to kind of mollify and let's say, restore their reputation, in Latin America. And they sort of look at this and behold, that's quite extraordinary, and China should kind of model on itself on this. So that's fascinating. I invite you to look at those passages. But just to take your question a little more narrowly now on what's going on in the South China Sea, I mean, I quite agree with you that it's not shocking. I mean, this area generally, not all of it, but most of the South China Sea is very proximate to China. I mean, these are China's maritime approaches, let's put it that way. So we can, I think we have to see that great powers, by and large, are, let's say, tend to be assertive in their, in the areas proximate. Seeing what Russia did in Crimea. So I think it's not, in that sense, we can even view some of China's actions there as reasonable. One more thing I want to say is that, China is an incredible maritime trading juggernaut. I think a study was recently done on the ship traffic that's going through the South China Sea, and some astronomical number or a percentage, something on the order of 78% is actually just going back and forth from Chinese ports. So the idea that China is going to kind of erect toll barriers and start, checking people's documents as they go in and out of the South China Sea, I mean, it's completely, in my view, harebrained. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I don't think China will seek to kind of cut off or restrict, any kind of movement or trade patterns. And just one more comment on South China Sea is to me, this makes very little sense as a military strategy. That is, you don't, in the age of precision weaponry, you don't set up, your key base on some rock somewhere, right? Because it will be destroyed in the first few minutes of any war. Okay, so these are not, key installations that will enable China to do, to launch some great war of aggression in Southeast Asia. No. What this is about symbols, right? In my view, Xi Jinping and the leadership cadres in China, they need these photos, the same photos that have ticked a lot of people off in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Those same photos, are something that are, making many Chinese people feel, proud that their country is standing up towards claims. These are rocks that China already occupied. They were occupied generally in the 1970s and 80s. So China's been there for a long time. They just haven't taken the step to build runways and so forth. So these, to use your words, that do not keep me up at night. And I think we can more or less say, China wants to pour concrete. I'm sorry for the corals, but the strategic implications are not extensive in my view.
Isaac.
Thanks.
He's a real South China Sea expert. I think we should direct all questions to Isaac. He's a very promising PhD candidate.
I wonder if just extending this question a bit further, if you could, and I don't know if you have one in the book or not, discuss what a cooperative, a virtuous cycle or a cooperative spiral might look like with respect to the U.S. and China and U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations in areas that may or may not fall within the purported Chinese Monroe Doctrine. And I guess just to throw some...
Oh, sorry, I missed the last sentence.
So if you could walk us through what a cooperative spiral would look like with respect to the U.S. and China and military activities in exclusive economic zones.
Okay, yes.
And just to sort of frame the problem in a way, what are the circumstances under which the United States is going to willingly accept reduced access to those areas, and what are the circumstances under which China would willingly reduce its capability to deny access to those areas?
Okay, I mean, those are excellent questions. I do take this up a bit, and by the way, I think Steve asked me whether I get beat up by my colleagues more or less, and over this question I do. I'll show you my black and blue marks and so forth. This is something that the U.S. Navy, I'd almost go so far as to say it's part of our DNA as an organization that is, as Isaac put it, the close-in surveillance. And I feel that I have made this a part of my cooperation spiral on the South China Sea, where I took it up very directly, and I invite you to look at the passages in that
a part of the book. The Southeast Asia chapter and the South China Sea discussion, that's actually the longest chapter in the book, so I feel very strongly about its importance, and as you can see, it's dominated in headlines. I call the title of the chapter, the new Fulda Gap, so the South China Sea is on everybody's mind. But here's where I take it up. I don't think you can see the wording here, but what I'm suggesting actually is part of the solution here is to, again, this is very hard for the U.S. to consider. In fact, I would go so far as to say, let's take off the table the idea that we were going to cease these operations. I don't think, we're just not going to get there. And what Isaac hasn't said is he's a specialist on maritime legal issues, and I think any maritime lawyers here would, immediately object to the idea that the United States would kind of stop this activity. And I myself feel that we need to continue this, at least the right to do this. We can go into the legal aspects of that. But what I'm arguing for is a reduction in surveillance. I think that can be done. I think it's very much in order, partly because we have other methods of gaining a lot of this surveillance, gaining the intelligence. But also I believe that this, the current intelligence posture, in my view, is doing a lot of damage to U.S.-China relations. They have now, several times, the Chinese have put this on par with the Taiwan issue, with Taiwan arms sales, as the kind of two bedrock issues that are poisoning U.S.-China security cooperation, security interaction. So how does this work in the spiral? What I'm saying is, if China were to open this giant new base that they built it's on the southern tip of Hainan Island. It's Yalongwan. It's a giant base. It's really, if you look at the satellite photographs, it has a cave of extraordinary dimensions. I mean, that is somewhat, you can understand why the ASEAN countries are a bit alarmed, right? And in fact, it tracks pretty well. The base was completed more or less around 2006, and a lot of this tension, has been flowing. But if you look at the dimensions, this base looks designed to hold a fleet of rather, enormous proportions. So it's disturbing, and like I said, a lot of it is invisible. That is, it's in caves and so forth. So I'm advocating that, not that they're going to open this to the U.S. Navy. I don't expect to get a tour anytime soon. But what about for the ASEAN nations? How about if the ASEAN states were to have an annualized tour of that and maybe a couple other Chinese bases in the area? To me, that would be a major step for Chinese transparency, and I think China could go there. As China often says, they don't have anything to hide. Honestly, I don't think that anybody would be surprised what they saw there, but it could be done, and that would be a major step. Now, in return, I think at that point, the United States should consider reducing our surveillance. It's been written in the New York Times. I honestly, I do not know, I think the actual number surely is classified somewhere, but the New York Times has said that these surveillance flights, for example, there are other types of surveillance, ships and so forth, but are happening on more or less a daily basis. Okay, that's a pretty high frequency in my, to my estimate. So I think that could be reduced, perhaps even dramatically, and I think that would be a very strong symbol to China that the United States is ready to move into a more kind of cooperative posture. And as I said, I think all that intelligence could be garnered in other ways. So that's how I see it playing out. And again, those are the first steps. It's what I call a linking of the transparency issue, which China has a big problem with transparency. I'll be the first to say that, and throughout the book you'll see again and again I'm saying China has to improve, and that is one of the major parts of the tension in U.S.-China relations is China's lackluster performance on transparency. But that's the way, if China can move forward, they have taken some positive steps there, but more, then we can start to move into the cooperation spiral there.
Just Richard? Go ahead.
Richard?
Yeah.
Peter.
Peter, I'm sitting here, going blind in my old age.
Let me preface, as you prefaced from the beginning, my views don't represent the Israeli stance. As a former officer in the Israeli military, actually head of our military cooperation to the Far East. But I'm curious, so I don't represent the views in this presence here. But I'm curious, I happen to agree with a lot of your views, and certainly on the side of what's going on in the South China Sea, and a lot of the rhetoric and the national rhetoric that's going on in China. And I think a lot of sort of the what you see in the headlines is, I argue most times, is really just political rhetoric.
Yeah.
And it's whether for its advancement and whoever the general is or whoever the military group is at the time or whatever the think tank. It seems to me, but I was curious from your perspective, and I have a couple questions I'm going to sort of add together if you don't mind. You say this, the escalation, which could potentially spiral out of control. I think I understand from you, and I think we all agree here, or certainly heard it in Steve's, we're not worried about World War III. I think what we may be worried about is an unintended accident, if you will, certainly considering some of the recent actions by the Chinese military of something happening, but yet I don't think that's going to lead to World War III either. I don't think it's anybody's interest. I don't find, taking the nationalistic views of the South China Sea aside, China has never been, if you will, is not really an aggressive nation. I don't think it's not looking to take over the world. I think it's certainly looking to exert itself as, and some people argue, you say China's a developing superpower. I think it is a superpower. There's no question about it. And I think it's just playing its role, if you will, and it's played a positive role, certainly on its courses in the UN. So I'm not sure if the rebalancing that you're referring to, is it that the U.S. has to be the number one at the end of the day, has to be the top? Is U.S. policy towards China sort of trying to encase it in a box where it's trying to slow down its military advancement in the world, having better technologies and more advanced equipment? And you're right, we are seeing that in many different areas within the Chinese military. But are we seeing this, and I'm not sure if you speak about it in your book, are you seeing some of the rhetoric on the U.S. side, and particularly on Capitol Hill, also being driven by the defense industry? I think the hawks, as we've seen, certainly, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the annual report the Pentagon puts out on China. Are you seeing some of that going on in Capitol Hill coming from the defense industry, the jobs and the opportunities, if you will, across the board, both for the U.S. military and for sales that they do across the world? Is that not also influencing the topic? And the last point I'd say to that, and you mentioned it briefly, is China's military sales to other parts of South America or some of the Arab states and so forth like that. And yes, is that a response? Is that maybe not just a natural evolution of its entrepreneurialism, no different than Boeing or Lockheed selling its planes and advanced equipment to our allies, and China creating its own goodwill in countries that it has strategic interests, and yet still being able to fill a gap of selling them equipment that's cheaper, maybe on par with the U.S. or more advanced. But is that just not natural?
All great points, and I have no real disagreement with your assessment. I mean, I do make the point in the book that I think it would be quite destabilizing if China began to export a lot of military equipment to Latin America. Historically, that has been a trigger, actually, and the United States has been extremely, reacted, let's say, very negatively to that kind of development.
Are you worried that equipment will be used against the United States, or
well, I mean, it seems far-fetched.
North America and South America?
Well, it seems very far-fetched today, I think, but like even not, as recently as we had the Hugo Chavez, that tension with the United States, and people were, there was a decent amount of muttering about what kind of equipment was the Venezuelan regime, importing and so forth. So, look, I'm not. It's not about. To me, it's not about practical constraints on what the United States can and can't do in Latin America. It's more. It's a lot of symbols. I mean, we all look at U.S. China relations here. I think we know so much of the discussion is about that. Now, I think many Chinese would say, well, let me get this straight. So the U.S. can sell weapons like crazy in our neighborhood, in China's neighborhood, and we can't sell weapons in America's backyard. That's completely unfair, and there's something to that. And I actually, Americans should reflect on that and think about, do we really, for example, I've been asked a lot in the last couple of weeks about American military sales to Vietnam, and I'm strongly recommending against that. I think, again, it's not so much I'm worried about the actual system, but I'm worried about the symbolic aspect of it, where many Chinese are concluding that the United States is hell-bent on, making trouble for China. So I think that's just one last thing I'll say, because I think we're running very low on time. But I am worried about inadvertent escalation. I'm worried about the planes colliding. I mean, it's happened before. People were killed before. I mean, could you imagine in 2001 if you know that our plane landed on a Chinese airstrip, it was seriously damaged. There were about 20 American servicemen on that plane. Can you imagine if they had been killed? I mean, that very well could have started a war. Absolutely. But so inadvertent escalation is a problem. But I'm also worried about wars that could happen by design. I mean, it seems very far-fetched, right? In our daily lives, and that, in fact, we are in the nuclear age. It's hard to conceive of war between nuclear powers, of course, this city knows better than anybody the financial costs that would arise from a conflict, and yet, wars happen. Countries calculate their interests and so forth. I mean, even who could have thought that we would be in this spot with Russia today? And now people even talk about that possible conflict. So I think we need to use all possible caution, restraint, and those of us who understand the details of this relationship need to work proactively to solve the major problems. Even the Taiwan issue, I don't want to raise that at this late hour, but
We don't have time for the Taiwan issue.
But even that, which has looked a lot better than it had, right? We don't talk that much about it now. Well, guess what? In the next year, you're going to hear a lot about Taiwan. So we need to deal with these bedrock, kind of fundamental contradictions, malblend. We need to talk about them, deal with them, begin to move forward. We haven't made as much progress as I would have hoped.
We are out of time, but Lyle, thank you. So this has given you a flavor of the kind of stuff that is in the book. It really is. It's got some very imaginative proposals in it, very specific and well worth reading. But thank you so much for joining us.